Over the entire duration of the anti-terrorist operation in the Donbass, not a single unit took part in any operation fully staffed. The shortage of manpower and vehicles forced the Ukrainian command to spread out its forces. Losses and breakdowns forced them to fight with what they had, rather than what they should have had, according to official documents. Combined units were being used everywhere. Any of the brigades of the armed forces of Ukraine could simultaneously be present both in the ATO zone and, for example, outside of it, on the border with Transnistria. Russia, on the contrary, deliberately spread out its troops. You can always say that a certain division is at the point of permanent deployment and has not moved out to some other position. You can show foreign journalists the battle banner, headquarters, and a crowd of conscript soldiers in the barracks. No one will notice the absence of hundreds of contracted soldiers. In case of the death or capture of fighters, they will be retired, and Putin will repeat for the 100th time, they are not there. This is the 14th episode of the series about the ATO, the history of war. We're trying to understand the course of the anti-terrorist operation in the east of Ukraine, its causes and effects, what does Russia have to do with it, and how the aggression of Russia against Ukraine could pose a threat to Europe. The Russian presence in the Donbass was gradually increasing. Initially, those were groups of special operations forces. Their task was to train the so-called militia. The quality of the fighters hardly mattered. Those insurgents did not need to have fighting capacity. The only thing they had to do was pose in front of TV cameras, while the real combat work was being done by specially trained people. Gradually, the army was replenished with military vehicles, crews, and instructors. A structure was formed: command, communications, intelligence, electronic warfare, local government, and security. In addition to that, demonstration units and commanders were specially created for propaganda purposes. It's all very simple. A typical average guy, a car washer Arseny Pavlov, Motorola, the commander of the so-called Sparta battalion, driver and loader Mikhail Tolstych, aka Givi, the commander of the Somali battalion. Those people appeared on TV screens quite often, gave comments, and created the illusion of a successful battle. In contrast to Colonel Igor Gherkin of the Central Investigative Administration of FSB General Borodai, those people were difficult to convict for involvement in the Russian security forces. That allowed one to speak of them as real volunteers who defend their land. At the same time, the fact that Russian special forces fought under the aegis of those units, substituting each other on a rotational basis, did not interest many. Special forces are not just a well-trained infantry. Those are people capable of reconnaissance, analyzing the enemy, thinking outside the box, planning operations, and acting courageously and efficiently. There were a few such specialists in the Ukrainian army, but not a single offensive was orchestrated without their participation. On July 21st, the town of Toretsk, called Dzerzhinsk at the time, was liberated. Two groups of the Ukrainian 73rd Marine Special Operations Center entered the city early in the morning. They got into the city administration building and took positions around it. Another fact that contributed to the success: on the eve, the commander of the special unit changed into civilian clothing and conducted additional recon of the area to determine a safe exit route. The battle began. The enemy used tanks, armored personnel carriers, and flamethrowers. The building was set on fire by one of the hits. Attracting the attention of the terrorists and provoking them to frontal attacks, the special forces fought for over 6 hours. Methodically killing off the attackers, the soldiers of the Special Operations Forces called for air and artillery support at the right times. As a result, the militants suffered severe losses and were forced to retreat. During that operation, the armed forces and units of the National Guard of Ukraine made a maneuver to block the city and cut it off from the neighboring town of Horlivka. The operation was carried out successfully, and the fighting was over by the end of the day. On the same day, the towns of Rubizhne and Solidar in the Luhansk Oblast were liberated. Russian propaganda claimed that MLRS, multiple launch rocket systems, were used to fire at the city, but the only building that sustained considerable damage was the city administration. There were no casualties among the civilian population. One Ukrainian soldier was killed in action during the liberation of Toretsk. The word operation is used for a reason here. It is sometimes not necessary to introduce troops into a city, but just cut off the ammunition supply lines having occupied the high ground. In conditions of the densely populated east of Ukraine, by liberating one small town, you can automatically gain control over the neighboring ones. Everything is interconnected, and the collapse of the terrorist defense is a natural phenomenon. Despite the fact that the militants blew up the bridge that connected the two cities, the neighboring Severodonetsk was also liberated on July 22nd after Rubizhne. The preparations began for the liberation of Lysychansk. Further to the south, as a result of a similar operation, the government forces gained control over Popasna right after Soledar. Thus, the Ukrainian command developed a specific and well-devised plan of action for every settlement. They conducted reconnaissance, found the enemy's weaknesses, and resolved the strategic issues of logistics and collaboration. It should be noted that an army that is being controlled from one HQ is always much more effective than disparate groups, even if they're heavily armed. The very same day, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine recognized the LPR and DPR as terrorist organizations. Back on July 19th, a large combined arms operation to liberate the city of Lysychansk began. Moving towards Luhansk, the Ukrainian army could not afford to leave such an important bastion of Russian-backed forces behind. The armed forces, National Guard and volunteer units were involved in fulfilling the tasks assigned by their high command. The defense of Lysychansk was represented by well-equipped positions in the suburban heights and fortifications in the city itself. The militants had one of the maintenance tunnels of the Lysychansk oil refinery at their full disposal, which allowed them to maneuver secretly by quickly moving through this underground network of tunnels. Moving towards Lysychansk, the army took control of roads and key heights. The city was an important link in the terrorist defense system and was well covered. The ATO forces found a formidable fortification near Verkhnyo-Kamenka. The situation was aggravated by the fact that the approaches to the enemy positions were blocked by a 3-kilometer-long railroad train, which the militants welded to the rails. That man-made wall prevented an attack from a convenient direction, and the firing positions at the main height prevented the way from being cleared. In the end, the battle near Verkhnyo-Kamenka lasted a long 7 hours without a break. But despite fierce resistance, the city was partially blocked, first from the west, then from the south. Operations in Rubizhne and Severodonetsk were part of the Lysychansk operation, and having taken those satellite cities under control, the Ukrainian armed forces also blocked the Russian-backed troops from the north. There were not enough forces to fully surround the city, so Luhansk was occupied part by part, thereby pushing the enemy out. Being in the city itself, cleanup squads faced fierce resistance. From high-rise buildings, they were fired upon by snipers, machine guns and mortar shells. At the crossroads, there were firing positions that literally had to be removed by tank gunfire. The fighting in the city kept raging on right up until the evening. The militants only used the slogans about protecting civilians to justify their actions. To establish positions, they threw out the locals from the apartments they liked, having little regard for the fate of the rest of the residents of the building. After all, if a sniper is shooting from a window of a high-rise, there will most probably be return fire, and the best way to deal with the sniper is by tank fire. On July 24th, servicemen of the Security Service of Ukraine found a bomb in the building of school number 4 in the liberated Slavyansk. In addition to the explosive device itself, explosive components were discovered. Given the existence of a remote detonation system, explosive experts made the assumption that the terrorists were preparing to blow the school up at the beginning of the school year on September 1st. In total, after the liberation of Slavyansk, more than 800 explosive objects were discovered and rendered harmless in the city. On the night of the same day at 22:20, fighters of the Donbass Volunteer Battalion raised the Ukrainian flag over the building of the Lysychansk City Council. Local residents were able to come out of the basements. They returned to their apartments, which the militants had occupied as firing positions. Distribution of water and food was established. The volunteers in particular helped with that, having quickly delivered a truck full of different food products to the city. Lysychansk was liberated as a result of joint actions by units of the National Guard, the Donbas Battalion, and the 24th, 51st, and 95th Brigades of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. The final cleanup of the city lasted several days, and the enemy saboteurs managed to pull off a couple more sorties. In the end, the operation to liberate Lysychansk cost the lives of at least 15 Ukrainian military officers and soldiers. On July 25th, during the briefing of the National Security and Defense Council, the loss figures over the entire course of the anti-terrorist operation were announced. As of that date, 325 fighters were killed in combat. 1,232 people sustained injuries of various severities. At the same time, the death rate of military personnel due to various accidents increased in a strange way in Russia. On July 26th, the last group of saboteur snipers was destroyed in the liberated Lysychansk. As a trophy, a Kamaz truck was captured, which was loaded with missiles for the mobile anti-aircraft missile complex Strela-10. In addition to that, many different small firearms were found, including sniper rifles produced by the Russian Federation. The city was cleared of militants, finally. War is the art of deception, and the best battle the one that didn't happen. It should be understood that a military operation, even a perfectly planned one, will fall apart if the enemy learns about its details. There were many traitors and simply sympathizers of the Russian world in the Ukrainian headquarters of early mid-2013. There's nothing surprising about that. The previous officials deliberately pursued a well-devised policy of reducing the combat readiness of the Ukrainian army, and if the key commanders could have been quickly replaced, a large number of middle-ranking officers did their black work unnoticed, sabotaging the work. Traitors did not always work for money. Some of the officials and the military were simply brainwashed by propaganda. After all, they also watched Russian television before the war. Secure communication could only be dreamed of, while secrecy was very conditional. That was one of the reasons why local commanders knew only fragments of the big plan, sometimes not even being aware of combat tasks of the neighboring units. That is why, on July 25th, the commanders of the 25th and 95th Brigades, Yuri Sodol and Mikhailo Zabrodsky, as well as the commander of the 1st Battalion of the 25th Brigade, Yevhen Moisyuk, personally arrived in Kramatorsk, where the ATO headquarters was located at the time. Chief of the General Staff of Ukraine Viktor Mushenko summoned those commanders to the headquarters in order to assign them important combat missions personally in the atmosphere of strict secrecy. By the dawn of July 26th, the advanced detachments of the 25th Brigade moved out towards Debaltsevo. The task was to bypass the city and create conditions for the passage of the second echelon of troops towards Shakhtarsk and Saur-Mahila. According to the plan of the operation, several objectives were pursued at once. The first one was to divide the so-called New Russia in half by separating the DPR from the LPR, by taking control of communications in the Debaltsevo and Shakhtarsk regions. The second one was to support and unblock the detachments of the 72nd, 79th and 24th Brigades at the state border. Under constant fire from Russian territory, those troops found themselves in a difficult situation as they were cut off from the supply line and were suffering major losses. To remedy the situation, the 1st Battalion of the 95th Brigade was to go to the south and, in cooperation with the 1st Battalion of the 30th Brigade, occupy the burial Mount Saurmahila as well as several border settlements. At first, part of the forces of the 25th Brigade bypassed the Baltzevo and, having gotten into a battle, gave Lysychansk Battalion a chance to advance further towards Kamyanka. The 1st Battalion of the 95th Brigade under the command of Zabrodsky was moving in a parallel course. Several separatist checkpoints were destroyed near Kamyanka. After spending the night in the village, on the morning of July 27th, the paratroopers moved further south towards Shakhtarsk. Along the way, they cleared the burial Mount Mohyla-Hostra and soon took the southeastern outskirts of the city without a fight. While diverting the enemy forces, Lysychansk Battalion provided a passage to Zabrodsky's battalion in the direction of Saurmahila. According to the plan, the 1st Battalion of the 95th Brigade left to the south, and the 1st Battalion of the 25th Brigade fortified in Shakhtarsk and prepared for defense. The Russian-backed troops, in turn, sent all their available forces to fight the Ukrainian paratroopers, having managed to accumulate up to 1,000 fighters and a huge arsenal of heavy weapons in the city. The hasty redeployment of troops led to the weakening of other sections of the front. Seeking to delay the offensive of Ukrainian troops, the leader of terrorists in Horlivka, Igor Bezler, put forward an ultimatum. He threatened to shoot all the prisoners and hostages, as well as to blow up the Horlivka chemical plant if the offensive continued. On July 28th, the cities of Debaltsevo and Lutuhino were liberated. In Shakhtarsk, still diverting a lot of terrorist troops, the 1st Battalion of the 25th Brigade fought fierce street battles. The militants fired the D-30 howitzers right from the main city square and 120mm mortars located at the stadium. The private sector was in flames from the numerous shell hits. At the same time, the 1st Battalion of the 95th Brigade, in cooperation with the 1st Battalion of the 30th Brigade, stormed the Saurmahila Mount and proceeded to accomplish the task of unblocking and withdrawing the surrounded units at the border. But as it turned out, the battle for the strategic height had just begun. By the morning of July 29th, Russian artillery fired upon the mount, forcing the defending fighters of the 51st Brigade to retreat. On July 30th, Avdiivka was liberated by volunteer units and the 93rd Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. The city would remain at the front line until 2018. The next day, the 1st Battalion of the 25th Brigade left Shakhtarsk. Over 3 days of fierce fighting, 22 paratroopers were killed and over 60 were wounded. Despite the high losses, the main mission was accomplished. Within a few days, more than 1,500 people safely left the encirclement at the border. This operation was included in textbooks on history and the art of warfare. In addition to that, Ukrainian television filmed a documentary about this raid. In 10 more days, the first battles for the town of Ilovaisk, which was previously unknown to the general public, began.